Tell my they don't respect me, they gonna respect me now. I'm young, I'm pretty, and can't possibly be beat.
He was everything you'd want in a running back. At 6'1" and 215 pounds, he had the size and the strength to make the tough runs between the tackles. But the speed and quickness was there too, as he could get outside and outrun would-be tacklers. And there were a lot of would-be tacklers, as Ricky Watters made defenders look silly for a decade. And if you somehow neutralized him on the ground, he would just go to work in the passing game, as one of the great dual-threat backs of all time. He coughed up the ball a little more than you wanted, and could get himself in trouble trying to turn nothing into something. But at the end of the day, Watters was an all-purpose machine who had a nose for the end zone, and showed up in the big games. His career didn't get off to the start he wanted, as after a frustrating 4 years at Notre Dame, he spent his whole rookie year injured, and came into his second season as a player who was looked at as selfish, cocky, emotional, and to some, even a bust. But Watters was unapologetically who he was. And when he finally got on the field, he backed up all his talking during an incredible career spent with San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Seattle as a perennial 1,000-yard rusher and the owner of one of the greatest non-MVP winning Super Bowl performances. And while Ricky Watters was a polarizing player, one thing everyone can agree on is that he was a problem on the field. Let's jog your memory. A Pennsylvania native, the future NFL star was adopted by James and Marie Watters and given the name Richard James Watters, or Ricky for short. Watters spent his high school days as a 4-year varsity player at Bishop McDevitt in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, playing both quarterback and running back while also showing his incredible elusiveness on special teams, earning him 2 All-State selections. By his senior year, the letters from schools were pouring in, but once Notre Dame head coach Lou Holtz came to his home and called him the finest tailback in the nation, it was a done deal. Watters would commit to the Irish. Watters joined an Irish team going through a down period, having not won more than 7 games since 1980. But the team they fielded in 1987 showed the beginning of something special. Notre Dame had a strong defense, and their offense was high-powered as well, with quarterback Tony Rice and running back Mark Green. But their star was future Heisman Award-winning receiver Tim Brown. Green had been the team's leading rusher last year, but barely rushed for over 400 yards. So the talented Watters was expecting to become the team's lead back early on. But in the first game of the season versus Michigan, Watters was stuck on the sideline and was getting frustrated. And by the fourth quarter of a game Notre Dame was winning, he started going up and down the sideline complaining. Holtz would hear him and put him into the game in an attempt to show Watters that the college game was no joke. But what did Watters do? On just his 3rd touch of the game, he took it 18 yards to the house. So Watters looked like the real deal, but he still didn't have a huge role as a freshman, finishing with 75 total touches in his 11 games and spending some time as a return man. But Notre Dame was rolling, sitting at 8-1 after 9 games. But they struggled after this, losing a close one to Penn State, then losing the season finale to Miami, before getting dominated by Texas A&M in the Cotton Bowl, as the Aggies held the Irish to 74 total rushing yards, with Watters' freshman season ending with him rushing for 373 yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding 70 more yards on 6 receptions. A lot of change occurred going into the 1988 season. Brown was gone for the NFL, leaving a big hole at the receiver position, which Notre Dame tried to fill with incoming freshman Rocket Ismail. But Holtz also decided to move Watters to flanker. And while Watters had the skill set for this position, he came to Notre Dame expecting to play running back, so he wasn't happy about the move, and he let Holtz know, leading to more headbutting between the two. But Watters still had an impact in his new position. While he didn't get many rushes, he also couldn't get anything going when he did, averaging less than 2.5 yards per carry. But he would lead the team in receptions while finishing 2nd in receiving yards. And he was a dangerous punt returner, racking up over 250 return yards and 2 return touchdowns. And behind one of the nation's best defenses, Notre Dame had a dream season, winning their first 5 games before taking on a top-ranked Miami team on a 36-game winning streak. But Notre Dame would pull off the 1-point upset in the game known as Catholics versus Convicts. And a couple weeks later, Notre Dame overtook the nation's #1 spot and were looking for a win against USC to wrap up an undefeated regular season. But they would be without 2 of their best players, as Watters and halfback Tony Brooks would be suspended by Holtz for multiple infractions regarding missing team meetings and functions. But Notre Dame didn't miss a beat, winning by 17 on the road, as they finished the year 11-0 and were set to take on number 3 West Virginia for the national championship in the Fiesta Bowl. And Waters was on the field in this game, and he would reel in a big 54-yard catch and run, which led to Notre Dame's final touchdown in a 34-21 win, as they would win the national title, with Waters' year seeing him rush the ball 30 times for 71 yards, while catching 15 balls for 286 yards and 2 touchdowns, and racking up 253 punt return yards with 2 more touchdowns. But Waters would be back at his more familiar tailback position come his junior season. Waters wasn't making himself any new friends on the team, as during a preseason practice, he would again push the limits on Holtz's team rules, resulting in the entire team getting punished. A fight would soon break out between Waters and safety Pat Terrell, and no one really rushed to break it up. But around that same time, Notre Dame had lost their top rusher from last year, in Tony Brooks, due to legal issues. So it looked like Waters would finally get his chance to be the lead back. Waters would have his best season to date, posting career highs on the ground and in overall touchdowns, while averaging over 6.5 yards per carry. And although he was the team's best producer at running back, he wasn't their top rusher, as that would be Rice. But he was still effective in the return game, taking back another punt for a touchdown. Notre Dame was again a powerhouse and would defeat number 2 Michigan in their second game of the season. Then the following week, Waters would score 2 touchdowns in a win over Michigan State. The team kept winning and would defeat 3 ranked opponents in consecutive weeks mid-season when they took down Air Force, USC, and then Pittsburgh. Then once again, they had an opportunity to wrap up a perfect regular season, this time against number 7 Miami. But the Hurricanes got their revenge for last year with a 27-10 win, dropping Notre Dame from number 1 to number 4, and they would eventually get an Orange Bowl matchup with the new number 1 team in Colorado. And in that game, their defense would hold the Buffaloes to 6 points to secure the win, as Waters' junior season had seen him rush for 791 yards and 10 touchdowns, while adding 196 more yards on 13 receptions and totaling over 200 punt return yards with a touchdown. 1990 would be a step back for Notre Dame, as Tony Rice was gone and replaced with Rick Meyer. Waters had a good year, but was overshadowed by Ismail's Heisman finalist campaign. However, it was clear that Waters would never be relied on to carry the rushing game, as he would get 10 less attempts than last season and be outrushed by Rodney Culver. Yet he would again lead the team in touchdowns, but he just wasn't getting as many touches as a senior, hauling in just 7 passes and only returning 3 punts. Notre Dame started strong with wins over Michigan and Michigan State to begin the season, but would lose to unranked Stanford in their 4th game. Then after winning 5 straight, including a defeat of number 2 Miami, they would finally return to the nation's top-ranked team, but they would lose their next game to Penn State and fall to 7th. And although they ended their year with a win over USC, they would also end with the worst ranking since Waters' freshman season, at number 5. But it was a repeat of last year, as they were back in the Orange Bowl, taking on a top-ranked Colorado team. But this year, they couldn't pull out the win, as Colorado held Notre Dame to just 9 points and won the game by 1. Yet Waters was responsible for the only Irish touchdown of the game. But his senior season ended with him rushing for 579 yards and 8 touchdowns, while adding 7 receptions for 58 more yards. So Waters' college career at Notre Dame was over, and while he had experienced incredible team success, he also didn't have the career he expected. And while a lot of it can be chalked up to the Irish having so many great ball carriers during Waters' time there, he would later say that Holtz never pushed for him to be as good as he could have been, and that this was largely due to Waters not fitting the Notre Dame image of a football player. But now Waters was set to enter the NFL draft, as a running back who had never led his team in rushing and had developed a reputation for having a selfish attitude. But the talent was there, so one team would be getting a steal. Waters was taken in the 2nd round by the team of the 80s, the San Francisco 49ers, who had won their 4th Super Bowl just 2 seasons earlier. But they had also moved on from longtime dual-threat star Roger Craig, so Waters was looked at as the perfect replacement that would keep their championship window open for years to come. But they'd be waiting longer than expected to see Waters on game day, as during training camp, he would suffer a broken foot. Then after working his way off of IR in week 5, he would break his hand just a couple weeks later before appearing in a game, as his rookie year was a wash. And even though he had never taken the field, many of his teammates were already labeling him as a bust, and Waters was alienating himself. His supreme confidence remained at the forefront, even while he was injured, leading to him becoming a running joke among the rest of the team. And after going down a second time, he isolated himself and would put on an extra 20 pounds. So his future was not looking bright. But after speaking with his parents and teammate Jamie Williams, things changed. Waters took his offseason training seriously and came back in shape, and his teammates noticed his improved work ethic. And while Waters had toned down some of his arrogance, his teammates were learning to accept him for who he is. And by the time the 92 season came along, Waters did become the perfect successor to Roger Craig. The Niners would boast a top 3 defense this year, but their offense was even better, finishing first in the NFL in points and yardage. They were led by quarterback Steve Young, who would take home league MVP this year, and a lot of his passes were going to superstar receiver Jerry Rice. But then there was Waters, who had the pleasure of running behind fullback Tom Rathman and would turn in a 1,000-yard season on the ground, and would tie with Rice for total touchdowns, while leading the Niners in yards from scrimmage, as he would ultimately earn a Pro Bowl selection. Waters' first career game saw him rush for 100 yards on just 13 carries against the Giants, and then he would show his dual threat ability in a Week 6 defeat of New England, when he had 104 yards and a touchdown on the ground, while also hauling in 8 passes for 84 more yards and another touchdown. Then after a 114-yard rushing performance in a Week 11 win over New Orleans, he would go for a season-high 163 yards with 2 touchdowns in a win over the Rams. But what makes Waters' 1,000-yard season even more impressive is that he got most of those yards in 12 weeks, as after the Rams game, he injured his shoulder the following week against the Eagles, appearing in 3 of the team's final 5 games and rushing for a combined 48 yards. But the Niners were rolling and were on an 8-game win streak to end the season at 14-2, as they would get a divisional matchup with Washington. Waters had a bigger workload in this game, going for 83 yards on 18 carries, as the Niners won and were heading to a conference finals matchup with the Cowboys. Waters would rack up nearly 140 yards from scrimmage, yet would commit a fumble, and the Cowboys would pull away in the fourth quarter to take the win, as Waters' first season had seen him rush for 1,013 yards and 9 touchdowns, while adding 43 receptions for 405 yards and 2 more touchdowns. Waters wasn't able to improve on his rookie year in '93, but he still racked up nearly 1,300 yards from scrimmage, while his 10 rushing touchdowns would be second in the league, leading to his second Pro Bowl selection. And while Waters' rushing numbers took a hit, Rathman also missed half the season, so Waters didn't have his lead blocker. But the Niners still had Steve Young and Jerry Rice, and would again lead the league in points and total yards. Week 3 would see Waters rush for 112 yards in a win over Atlanta. Then the following week, he would go for a season-high 135 rushing yards in a loss to New Orleans. He would hit 100 yards just once more this season, but a Week 14 defeat of Cincinnati would see him account for all 3 of the Niners' touchdowns. However, after that, a strained knee ligament kept him out of 3 of the team's final 4 games. And while it wasn't the same finish as last year, the Niners' 10-6 record was still enough to get them a divisional round matchup with New York, and Waters showed no ill effects with his knee. The Niners were playing the Giants, who were coming into the game as the league's top overall defense, who had only allowed 7 rushing touchdowns all year. But Waters decided to add a few to that total, as he would start with a first quarter touchdown, then in the second quarter, he would score 2 more touchdowns on the ground. Then in the third quarter, he scored his 4th, setting a divisional round record. Then for good measure, he added 1 more before the third quarter ended, as ultimately the Niners won 44-3, and Waters finished with 164 total yards and 5 rushing touchdowns.
I got one for my mom, my dad, my sister, and my nephew. Everybody.
The conference championship again brought Dallas, and again it ended in defeat for San Fran, as Waters would rack up a combined 70 yards and a touchdown. But the season had ended with Waters recording 950 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns, while adding 31 receptions for 326 more yards and another touchdown. Rathman was gone come the '94 season, and while Waters would play a full 16 games for the first time in his career, he would also have the worst rushing season of his career, putting up then career low numbers on then career high attempts, with a then career low 6 rushing touchdowns and a career high 8 fumbles. But he would record his highest yards from scrimmage total up to that point due to his career high in receptions and receiving yards, as he would lead all running backs in receiving yards and earn another Pro Bowl selection. Waters would have just 2 games with over 100 rushing yards and just 1 more game with over 65 yards on the ground. But through the air, he would have 10 games with at least 4 receptions and his first career 100-yard receiving game in a Week 16 defeat of Denver. when he had 4 catches for 106 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. And with Rice doing his usual work and Young turning in another MVP season, the 49ers still featured the highest scoring offense in the league. And when paired with one of the league's top defenses, they would finish with a 13-3 record, leading to a matchup with Chicago in the divisional. Waters would only have 14 touches for 73 total yards in the game, but he wasn't really needed, as the game was all but over by halftime. As had become customary, the path to the Super Bowl in the NFC went through Dallas, as San Francisco got yet another chance to take out the Cowboys. And this time they would succeed. The Niners came out on fire in the first quarter, scoring 3 straight touchdowns, with one of those being a 29-yard reception by Waters. And by the end of the game, Waters had over 100 yards from scrimmage, and the Niners had finally knocked off the Cowboys and were headed to a Super Bowl matchup with San Diego, and Waters was ready to show out. Waters would have a huge catch-and-run touchdown in the first quarter. Then in the second quarter, he would haul in his second receiving touchdown of the game. Then he would run in the first score of the second half, as he finished with 47 yards and a touchdown on the ground, along with 61 yards through the air and 2 more touchdowns, as the 49ers ran through the Chargers to capture their 5th Super Bowl. And while the performance by Waters would be MVP worthy in most Super Bowls, it was overshadowed by Steve Young throwing for over 300 yards and 6 touchdowns. But Waters ended his season as a champion and had finished with totals of 877 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 66 catches for 719 yards and 5 more touchdowns. So after that season, it seemed like the dynasty would resume in San Francisco. But come the 95 season, Waters had made a change. Waters and his agent had been exploring an extension late last season, and as the postseason went on, Waters clearly showed his value. But then he was offered a deal, which while it would have made him one of the league's highest paid backs, there was little security to it, as it was only for a single year. So then about a month later, he would instead sign a 3-year deal worth nearly $7 million with the Eagles, following Niners defensive coordinator Ray Rhodes, who had just become the Eagles head coach and was one of Waters' biggest supporters in San Francisco. And while the Niners GM would take a final jab at Waters and his attitude after Waters chose the Eagles, Waters wanted this new opportunity to show that he wasn't just a system back like he was being made out to be. Waters was brought in to help take the pressure off of quarterback Randall Cunningham, and would also pair with second-year back Charlie Garner to give the Eagles a great 1-2 rushing punch. But Waters did not make a good first impression on his teammates and Eagles fans, as in a season-opening loss to Tampa Bay, he would alligator arm a Cunningham pass across the middle. And when asked about his business decision after the game, Waters responded with his now infamous quote,
"For who? For what?
For who? For what?"
He says for who, for what. He was done. He was done.
For who, for what? These 4 words used to explain why he didn't extend and risk getting laid out in the season opener have unfortunately followed Waters everywhere and cast a cloud over a great career. And while it makes sense to not risk serious injury during a loss in the season opener, this response just reignited the narrative that Waters was only about himself. But Waters knew that all could be forgiven as long as he performed. Over his next 8 games, Waters racked up nearly 800 yards from scrimmage, but he was failing to find the end zone, scoring just 1 touchdown over his first 7 games. But around this time, the Eagles made a big change, as they would opt to bench the rocket-armed Cunningham for Rodney Peete, as Cunningham just wasn't the best fit for new offensive coordinator John Gruden's West Coast offense. Then come the second half of the season, the touchdowns were flowing for Waters. After finding the end zone in a Week 10 loss to Dallas, his next 4 weeks would see him rack up 2 touchdowns in each game, as the Eagles went 3-1 in that time. And from Week 10 to Week 15, he would score 10 of his 11 rushing touchdowns on the season, which would be good for 4th in the league. And he was showing that he didn't need the Niners' high-powered offense to be great, as he would finish as the Eagles' second leading pass catcher and would put up then career-high numbers on the ground by far, finishing top 10 in the league and combining with Garner for over 1,950 rushing yards, as he was again voted to the Pro Bowl. And the Eagles as a whole would finish with a 10-6 record, which would get them a wildcard matchup with Detroit. Philly would beat up on the Lions, as they ran up 58 points, with Waters going for 49 yards on the ground and adding 64 yards through the air with a touchdown. The divisional round brought a familiar foe for Waters, as the Eagles took on the Cowboys, but they would shut down the Eagles, as Waters would finish with 84 total yards in a loss. But Waters' first year as an Eagle had seen him rush for 1,273 yards and 11 touchdowns, while adding 434 yards on 62 receptions and one more touchdown. So his opening act in Philly had been quite impressive, but his 1996 encore would be his best. With the offseason retirement of Cunningham, it was the beginning of a new era in Philly, one that looked like it would be led by Waters for years. The Eagles had bolstered their receiving core by picking up veteran Pro Bowler Irving Fryer, but in the backfield, their Thunder and Lightning duo would combine for over 1,750 rushing yards, and Waters would be responsible for most of those, as he would rack up career highs in attempts, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, and would lead the league in rushing attempts, while finishing top 5 in both rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. And after adding in 444 more yards through the air, Waters would lead the NFL in yards from scrimmage in 96, as he would be voted to his 5th consecutive Pro Bowl. A Week 3 win over Detroit would see him rush for 153 yards and a touchdown, while adding 57 more yards through the air. Then in a win over Atlanta the following week, he would go for 121 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Over the next 2 weeks, he would have another 100-yard rushing game. Then in a Week 8 defeat of Miami, he topped his career high with 173 rushing yards and a touchdown. And he would record 2 more 100-yard rushing games this season, as he would rush for at least 75 yards in 10 of 16 games, while hauling in at least 3 passes in 9 games. The Eagles were a much improved offense, as they finished top 5 in yards and top 10 in scoring, which helped make up for a below-average defense, as they would again finish with a 10-6 record and get a wildcard matchup with Waters' former team. Pete had gone down for the season after 5 games, so the team was being led by Ty Detmer, and the Niners' top 5 defense would hold him to below 150 passing yards and 2 interceptions. And even though Waters had 20 rushing attempts, he was held to just 57 rushing yards, as the Eagles were shut out in a loss, with Waters' career rushing season seeing him gain 1,411 yards on the ground, along with 13 touchdowns, while hauling in 51 passes for 444 yards. Waters was again in the headlines prior to the 97 season, as his agent had reportedly threatened that he wouldn't play without an extension. And then Waters didn't report to minicamp, but come training camp, he was there and ready to play. But 1997 would be a year of regression for the Eagles, largely due to an unstable quarterback situation, with 3 QBs appearing in at least 5 games for the team. Waters did his usual work with another 1,000-yard season on the ground and over 1,500 yards from scrimmage. But for the 3rd straight year, his overall touches would drop. His rushing attempts and yards were his lowest since his arrival in Philly, and his 48 receptions were also his lowest total during his time as an Eagle. But that may be more so due to the QB play, as he had more targets than last year. Waters and Garner would still combine for over 1,650 yards, and the first 5 weeks of the season would bring incredible production from Waters, as he was averaging over 110 total yards per game. But after recording 200-yard rushing games in that time, he would not record another one all season, and he would really see his touches dwindle near the end of the year, as his final 3 games would see him get just 42 total touches, as the Eagles would lose those 3, along with 6 more this season, and would finish with a 6-9-1 record and miss the playoffs, as Waters had rushed for 1,110 yards and 7 touchdowns, while also hauling in 48 passes for 440 yards. But now his contract was up, and while he wanted an extension at the beginning of the season, he was now looking for a contract with a new team. Waters signed a 4-year deal with Seattle worth about $13 million prior to the 98 season. Throughout Waters' time in Philly, he had been butting heads with Gruden for a bigger role and more touches, reportedly with it even getting to the point that his girlfriend had berated Gruden near the end of last season. And with the Eagles still possessing Garner, they felt comfortable with letting Waters walk. And while Waters would still be the same guy who wanted as many touches as possible, the now 29-year-old back would embrace a veteran leadership role during his time as a Seahawk. The Seahawks were turning over a new leaf in the backfield. Moving on from longtime starter Chris Warren, they featured a 42-year-old Warren Moon at quarterback, and their top receiving option was Joey Galloway. And in joining his 3rd team, Waters showed that he was just a good running back, no matter where he was, as he would record his 4th straight 1,000-yard rushing season and would be a top 10 rusher in the league, while finishing top 5 in rushing touchdowns, and would add nearly 400 yards through the air. After 67 yards in the season opener, he would rush for over 100 yards in the following 2 games. Over his next 5, he would surpass 100 yards from scrimmage just once. But in Week 10, he would rush for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win over the Chiefs. The Seahawks would lose to Oakland the following week, and Moon would be benched in favor of John Kitna. And over the final 6 games, Waters would see his touches go down, with the exception of a Week 16 defeat of Indianapolis, when he rushed for a career-high 178 yards on 30 carries with a touchdown, and added 3 catches for 38 more yards. But the Seahawks would end the year with a loss to Denver, and even though Waters had just 13 rushing yards, he would throw his only career touchdown pass in that game. But Seattle finished with an 8-8 record, which wasn't enough for the playoffs, as Waters' first year as a Seahawk had seen him rush for 1,239 yards and 9 touchdowns, while adding 52 catches for 373 more yards. Seattle had spent a lot of money over the offseason to bring in longtime Packers coach Mike Holmgren. Moon was gone, as Kitna was the starter all year, but he was without his best weapon for half the season, as Galloway would miss 8 games. Waters had another 1,200-yard rushing season, but his 3.7 yards per carry was his lowest average in 6 years, and his 3rd consecutive season averaging less than 4 yards per carry. And his 5 rushing touchdowns were also a career low, with his 40 receptions being his lowest since his 2nd season. But while Walter Jones and Pete Kendall anchored the left side of the line, the right side wasn't as strong, and without Galloway for a lot of the season, it made it easy for teams to focus in on Waters. He would still record over 100 yards from scrimmage in 3 of his first 4 games, and have 4 100-yard rushing games over the remainder of the season. And even though Seattle had one of the league's worst rushing offenses, who knows how bad it would have been without Waters, as he accounted for nearly 86% of their rushing yards. So he played a huge role in the team finishing with a 9-7 record, which would be enough for a wildcard matchup with Miami. Unfortunately, Waters just couldn't get anything going this game, as he only averaged about 2 yards per carry, and finished with 62 total yards, while being held scoreless in a 20-17 loss, with Waters' year ending with him rushing for 1,210 yards and 5 touchdowns, while hauling in 40 passes for 387 yards and 2 more touchdowns. But the offseason made it look like the Seahawks were beginning to plan for a future without Waters. Waters had turned 31 in the spring, and the Seahawks used their first-round pick to draft his future replacement in Alabama's Shaun Alexander. On top of this, Seattle had shipped away Galloway for 2 future first-rounders, yet they would still get good years from veteran Sean Dawkins and rookie Darrell Jackson. Kitna didn't have the best year, but Waters may have felt Alexander breathing down his neck, as he would put together his most efficient rushing season in years. His rush attempts would be his lowest since his time in San Francisco, but his yardage total was his highest since his career year in Philly 5 years earlier, as he would average 4.5 yards per carry, with this being his 6th straight season with over 1,000 yards rushing. And he would have the 2nd best receiving season of his career, tying for the team lead in receptions and finishing 3rd in receiving yards, as he would tie his career high in yards from scrimmage, even finishing top 5 in the league. Alexander didn't get a lot of touches, but he made the most of them, and he and Waters would combine for over 1,550 yards. But Waters was still the star. He would have 11 games with at least 90 yards from scrimmage and really come on near the end of the year, as a Week 13 loss to Denver saw him rack up over 200 yards from scrimmage, with 77 and a touchdown on the ground, and then 126 more through the air, on 9 receptions. Then in the 3rd quarter of a defeat over Atlanta the following week, he became the 13th player in NFL history to rush for 10,000 yards. And then in the second last game of the season versus Oakland, he rushed for 168 yards on 26 attempts, while adding 37 more yards on 4 receptions. But overall, the Seahawks were regressing, and would finish with just a 6-10 record and miss the playoffs, as Waters' season ended with him rushing for 1,242 yards and 7 touchdowns, while adding 613 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air on 63 catches. But his reign near the top would come crashing down during the 2001 season. Waters showed no signs of slowing down to begin 01, racking up 140 yards from scrimmage in a season-opening win, then 81 rushing yards in Week 2. But in Week 3, he suffered a shoulder injury, and while he could have had surgery and came back in about 4 weeks, he decided to let it heal on its own, which doubled the recovery time, as this would also end his consecutive game-started streak at 116, which was the 2nd longest in history for a running back after Walter Payton's 170. So he missed the next 8 games, then came back in a Week 13 loss to Denver, and had 23 yards on the ground. Then the following week against Dallas, he went for 104 yards and a touchdown on the ground, and added 34 yards through the air. But the following day, it was announced his season was over due to a broken ankle suffered in the Dallas game, as overall the Seahawks finished with a 9-7 record but missed the playoffs. And Waters' 5 games had seen him rush for 318 yards and a touchdown, as well as haul in 11 passes for 107 more yards. The Seahawks opted not to re-sign Waters after the season, and while he still had interest from other teams, he wasn't willing to play for the veterans minimum that most teams were offering. So he elected to sit out the 0-2 season. And while he still didn't get the contract offer he wanted, he would decide to retire altogether, ending his career after 10 seasons. It would take Waters some time to find his purpose after football, but he has now focused his attention to mentoring young athletes and helping all athletes through his Impact Wellness Company, which offers holistic options to manage health and pain. Ricky Waters walked away from the game with over 10,000 yards rushing, over 4,000 yards receiving, and nearly 15,000 yards from scrimmage, as well as 91 total touchdowns. He was a 5-time Pro Bowler and Super Bowl winner. He was consistent year in and year out, and produced for every team he played on, while never wanting to take a play off. But his attitude and outspokenness, and specifically a couple ill-advised quotes, seem to have rendered his accomplishments unknown as time goes on. He wasn't a perfect person, but if the worst thing about him is that he can get a little emotional, that seems worth it for season after season of at least 1,500 yards from scrimmage. He spent a decade in the NFL and was among the league's best from year 1 until year 10, and was a catalyst in the Niners' 5th Super Bowl win. Then even if it painted him in a bad light, he knew he had to leave to prove everyone, including himself, that he wasn't a product of a system, and he definitely did that in Philly. Then as most backs start to slow down, Waters was aging like fine wine near the end of his time in Seattle. And if the injuries don't happen, who knows what his career totals could have gotten to. So yeah, Ricky Waters is polarizing, and he could rub you the wrong way, but he gave you everything he had and then some. And one thing was certain, no matter how many times you got him the ball, it would never be enough for Ricky Waters. But that's it for today's episode on Ricky running Waters. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on another misunderstood star, or this one on another player with an overlooked Super Bowl performance. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.